The royal family has gathered in Scotland for their annual summer break at Balmoral. It marks a rare occasion that they're all together, but there's one high-profile absentee from this year's events.
As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles, which have meant so much to me.
Prince Louis was playing quietly on the grounds of Balmoral Castle when Queen Camilla's grandchild said something that shook the entire royal household to its core, and the decision that followed sent a message the palace would never forget. Balmoral Castle sits in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by mountains, open moorland, and rivers that run silver in the summer light. Every year without fail, the royal family retreats there to escape the cameras, the schedules, and the weight of a life lived entirely in public view. For the children, it is the one place where being royal feels closest to normal. There are no formal appearances, no rehearsed smiles for photographers, and no carefully worded statements being drafted in advance. Louis had no reason at all to believe that anything was about to change that afternoon. So keep watching, because what was said to him out on those grounds was about to force his father to make a move the palace had never seen before. Camilla's grandchildren had been included in that Balmoral gathering the way they had gradually become included in more things over the previous few seasons. As the years passed and Camilla settled deeper into her role as queen, her extended family had quietly found themselves invited into spaces that had previously been reserved for the most immediate members of the royal household. No formal announcement was ever made about this shift. It happened slowly, the way many changes inside royal life tend to happen, through small adjustments and quiet allowances that individually seemed harmless enough and collectively amounted to something much more significant. There were children scattered across the grounds that afternoon, while the adults held their conversations a short distance away. No member of staff was watching the moment closely enough to fully understand what was developing until it had already taken place. Louis had been near the East Garden Wall when one of Camilla's grandchildren approached him. What was said has never been confirmed in precise detail, and the exact words remain known only to those who were present in that part of the grounds. But multiple accounts from sources close to the family describe it as pointed and deliberate, far beyond what would be expected of an ordinary thoughtless remark exchanged between children on a summer afternoon. The words reportedly targeted his mother directly and reached back to the memory of Princess Diana in a way that was specific enough to feel rehearsed rather than accidental. The child spoke with a confidence that suggested those words had been absorbed from somewhere before being repeated, without any genuine understanding of the weight they were carrying or the damage they were capable of doing. Louis went quiet for a moment. Then Louis cried. He did not stay in the garden, and he did not say anything to the children around him. He turned and walked directly back toward the castle, moving past the garden staff without a word, and he did not stop until he found his mother inside. Catherine was in one of the interior sitting rooms when he came to her. Those who know how close she is to her 3 children understand immediately why what she saw on his face affected her the way it did. He was not throwing a tantrum, and he was not looking for attention. He was a child who had been genuinely hurt in a way that sat quietly inside him, which was in some ways harder to witness than anything louder would have been. She knelt down and listened to him carefully. She kept her voice steady and calm while he told her what had happened. Inside, her expression did not shift in the way that most people would have in that moment. Those who know Catherine well describe her as someone who pulls things inward before she ever shows them outward, who processes before she reacts, and that afternoon was no different from that pattern. She held him close, reassured him, and waited until he had completely settled. Then she stood, smoothed her clothes, and went to find William. William was in another part of the castle with a small group when Catherine came to him. She did not raise her voice. People who have spoken about the moment say she barely needed to. She told him quietly what had been said to their son, and the room around them shifted in a way that those nearby noticed without fully understanding. Those who were present say William's face did not produce the expression of someone hearing something that surprised him. It produced the expression of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of moment to arrive. The kind of look that settles over a person when a line that should never have been crossed finally is. He said very little in that moment. He did not storm off or raise his voice or do anything that the room might later remember as dramatic. He excused himself quietly and calmly. And what he did in the hours and days that followed would permanently change every unspoken arrangement that had existed inside that family for years. That evening, after the castle had quieted and the children were settled in their rooms, William and Catherine spoke privately. The conversation has never been described in full, but those aware that it took place describe it as one of the most significant exchanges between the two of them in recent years. Catherine was not emotional in the way the tabloids would later try to portray her. She was steady and she was clear, and she said what needed to be said without dressing it in softer language. She reminded William of something he already knew, but had perhaps allowed himself to set aside in the interest of keeping things smooth. She reminded him that the institution had failed to protect people before, and those people had mattered to him in a very personal way. She did not need to say the name out loud. William knew exactly who she meant, and the silence around Princess Diana's name sat heavier in that room than the name itself ever could have. She was not asking him to start a war, and she was not asking him to make a public scene. She was asking him to do the one thing that royals inside this institution rarely allow themselves to do, which was to act decisively before the problem became too large and too settled to fix without causing significant damage. She had watched things drift for long enough, and she was telling him plainly that she would not keep watching them drift when it came to their children. The room was quiet when she finished. William stood near the window for a long time without speaking. Outside, the Scottish hills were dark against the night sky, and the grounds were still and cold. People who have known William across different chapters of his life describe him as someone who carries something his public image does not often reveal, which is a deep and very personal understanding of what it means to be failed by the people around you when you are young and cannot protect yourself. He was a boy once who watched his mother navigate a life without enough protection from the institution that was supposed to surround her, and that experience never fully left him. Standing in that room, listening to his wife describe what had been said to their youngest child, something inside him did not break. It resolved. He was not going to wait for things to quietly correct themselves the way the institution preferred. He was going to act, and the way he chose to act would not look like anger, because it was not anger. And when the palace finally understood what he had put in motion, it became clear that a line had been drawn that nobody inside those walls was going to be able to quietly move. Within days of returning to London, William called a meeting that appeared on no official schedule and was not listed anywhere that outside eyes might find it. The staff who were summoned described being asked to leave personal phones at the door before entering the room, which was unusual enough to make everyone present immediately aware that whatever was happening inside was not a routine discussion. Legal advisors arrived through a private entrance at the rear of the building. Senior members of the household staff were present. The gathering was held in a private room at the Kensington Palace offices, and the atmosphere inside was described by those who attended as controlled and focused in a way that left no space for casual conversation or questions that strayed from the matter at hand. William brought a folder to that meeting. It was not a rough draft of concerns or a preliminary list of complaints. It was a structured plan, methodical and specific, and already worked through in enough detail that it was being presented not as something open for debate, but as something that had already been decided and simply needed to be understood and implemented by the people in that room. The plan addressed members of Camilla's extended family by name and outlined their involvement in official royal arrangements going forward, not Camilla herself and not King Charles. The focus was the wider circle of non-royal relatives who had, gradually and without any single dramatic turning point, become woven into the fabric of official royal life in a way that had gone unaddressed for too long. The terms of the plan were precise, and they were unambiguous. These individuals would no longer appear on guest lists for events hosted by or attended by the Wales household. They would not be included in formal family photographs released to the press. They would not be seated near the Wales children at official dinners or any other engagements. Invitations that had previously been extended would not be extended again. There were no gray areas in the language, and no individual exceptions carved out for specific relationships or circumstances. It had been written with the kind of clarity that does not allow for reinterpretation at a later date. William sat at the head of the table through the entire meeting without raising his voice once. Staff members who attended described the experience of watching him deliver the plan as genuinely unusual, because the quietness he carried throughout was not the quietness of someone managing difficult emotions or holding something back. It was the quietness of someone who had already worked through every version of the situation and arrived at a conclusion he fully intended to hold regardless of whatever resistance might follow. One person present later described it as sitting across from someone who had already accepted every consequence and was simply waiting for everyone else in the room to catch up to where he had already arrived. The meeting did not run long. The instructions were precise, and when there were no remaining questions, William thanked those present, stood, and left. The folder stayed on the table. The royal family operates on a hierarchy that has been in place for centuries, and one of its most fundamental principles is the order in which decisions are supposed to travel through the institution. Nothing of real significance is done unilaterally by a junior member without first moving through proper channels. If a member of the family intends to take a step that affects official palace arrangements, particularly arrangements that involve other senior members of the household, they are expected to first seek the approval of the monarch. This is not merely ceremonial. It is the architecture through which the institution maintains order and presents itself to the outside world as a unified body. Bypassing it is not simply unusual. Within the culture of the palace, it is an act that carries a weight that almost everyone inside those walls understands immediately. William bypassed it completely. He did not call King Charles before the meeting took place. He did not request a private audience to raise his concerns and seek guidance on how to proceed. He did not go through the quiet diplomatic channels that the palace traditionally uses to manage internal disagreements before they have the chance to grow into something visible. He put the plan into action first, and only after the instructions had already been issued did a formal letter leave the Wales household and make its way to the king. The letter was not requesting approval, and it was not inviting a response or opening a dialogue. It was an informational document. It told the king what had been decided, what had already been implemented, and what the standing arrangement would be from that point forward. It was framed as a conclusion and not as the beginning of a conversation. Those inside the palace who understood what this meant described it as extraordinary in a very specific and carefully defined way, not because the concern that prompted it was unreasonable, and not because the action itself was wrong by any straightforward measure. It was extraordinary because of what it signaled about the person who had sent it. For the first time in recent memory, the Prince of Wales had acted with the full authority of someone who did not believe he needed permission. He had drawn a line, issued a directive, and then informed the king that the line existed. The letter was polite, and the language inside it was measured and careful, but the message it carried was unmistakable to anyone who understood how the institution worked and what the very existence of that letter actually meant. To fully understand how this moment arrived, it is necessary to step back and examine how things had been developing across the years that preceded it, because what happened at Balmoral did not occur in a vacuum or arrive without a history behind it. It was the final moment in a much longer story, and that story had been unfolding quietly for long enough that most people outside the palace walls had never noticed it was happening at all. When Camilla formally joined the royal family, the early understanding was that her presence in official spaces would remain at a respectful distance from the deep inner workings of the household. The public acceptance of her role took years and considerable effort to build, and even as she became more settled in her position, there existed an unspoken boundary around which of her family members could reasonably be considered part of the official royal circle, and which could not. Over time, that boundary began to soften at its edges. Her children from her first marriage, her grandchildren, and certain other members of her extended family began appearing at events with increasing regularity. They appeared in photographs that were released from official occasions, They occupied seats at formal dinners where staff members who had served across multiple decades found themselves noticing faces they had not expected to see in those rooms. None of this movement was ever announced, and none of it was subject to any kind of formal review or approval process. It shifted the way quiet influence always shifts inside large tradition-bound institutions, which is gradually and without a single obvious moment at which someone could have clearly said that this was the point where things had gone too far. Senior members of the household staff, who had served across multiple royal households, were uncomfortable with the pace of the changes, but discomfort inside the palace is rarely spoken aloud. It is noted, absorbed, and carried quietly by people whose professional role requires them to keep things running smoothly regardless of their private views about how those things are arranged. But discomfort that is never addressed has a way of accumulating over time until it finds a place to land. The incident at Balmoral was not the beginning of the underlying problem. It was simply the moment at which years of quiet accumulation became impossible to continue absorbing without a response. When Camilla learned what William had put in motion, the reaction came quickly, and it came with force. Closed-door conversations followed in rapid succession over the days after the letter arrived at the king's household. Sources inside the palace describe a series of urgent exchanges during that period, with voices raised behind doors that were closed more firmly than usual, and footsteps moving through corridors at hours when the building was typically quiet and still. Camilla was deeply unhappy with what had happened, and the source of her unhappiness was not solely the practical content of what the letter contained. It was the manner in which it had arrived. It had not come to her with a request for a private conversation. It had not come through an intermediary who might soften the impact of what was being communicated. It had come as a declaration, structured and formal and entirely final, and there was nothing in its language that invited any response other than acknowledgement and compliance. She went to King Charles and asked him to intervene. She asked him to use his authority as the sitting monarch to call William back, to open a dialogue, and to find a path toward a resolution that felt less like a unilateral verdict. She believed that Charles had both the right and the responsibility to step in when one member of the family took an action of this nature against another. She believed that his silence on the matter would itself constitute a message, and she was not wrong about that. Charles listened carefully to everything she said. Those who know him well describe his response as entirely characteristic of the way he manages conflict within the family, which is with genuine patience and genuine personal difficulty, and very rarely with decisive action in any clear direction. He was not well during this period. The health challenges he had been managing for some time had worn on him in ways that were visible to those around him, in private even when they remained carefully concealed from the public eye. He looked at the letter. He considered what his son had done and why he had done it. And according to those with some knowledge of what followed, he made a choice that surprised a number of the people closest to him. He chose not to overrule William. He did not send a response that demanded the terms be renegotiated or reversed. He did not call for a family meeting in which both positions could be aired and some middle ground could be mapped out. He sat with the full weight of what his son had done, and he let it stand. Whether that decision came from a genuine belief that William had been right to act the way he did, or from an exhaustion that made confrontation feel impossible to sustain, or from a clear-eyed recognition that the center of gravity inside the family had already shifted in a direction he could not quietly reverse, is something that only Charles himself could fully answer. But the effect of his silence was felt through the palace almost immediately. Staff members who had spent years reading the informal signals of where authority actually lived within the household began noticing the shift. The Wales household had always carried considerable presence and weight. After that week, the nature of that presence had changed, and it had changed in a way that was subtle, but that no one who understood how these things worked could honestly say they had missed. Then something happened that changed everything. What had been managed entirely inside the palace walls began, in fragments, to surface in the world outside. The public image that William and Catherine had built with great care over many years was deliberate and genuine and deeply earned. They were the modern face of the monarchy, photographed at school visits and mental health awareness events and community engagements that spoke to a vision of royal life that felt connected to the realities of ordinary people. William spoke openly about the importance of emotional honesty and the damage done when men in particular are expected to push difficult feelings aside. Catherine poured enormous energy into building organizations focused on early childhood development and the long-term effects of childhood experience on adult well-being. They were thoughtful and consistent in everything they chose to present, and the result was a reservoir of public goodwill that had only grown deeper as the years passed. What the public rarely saw was the version of William that existed inside those private rooms and private conversations. Not because he was concealing something troubling or at odds with the person he presented publicly, but because the private version of him simply does not fit neatly into the warm and accessible narrative that public royal life requires and rewards. People who know William say this is just who he is behind closed doors. He doesn't second-guess himself, and he doesn't care if the people around him are uncomfortable with his choices. The quiet control he showed at that meeting in London wasn't a show. It was a preview of exactly how he intends to run the country when he takes the throne. What happened at Balmoral and in the weeks that followed gave the world its clearest picture yet of how King William V will approach the crown. He will not be a monarch who waits for permission to protect the people he is responsible for protecting. He will not defer to tradition or to institutional preference when either one requires him to absorb something he has decided is unacceptable. He will draw lines, and he will hold those lines, and the people who work around him will understand, without needing to hear it stated twice, that those lines are not symbolic or negotiable. And the palace had just been given a very clear demonstration of it. When fragments of what had taken place began reaching the public, the reaction did not unfold the way the tabloids might have anticipated or hoped for. There was no widespread criticism of William for acting above his station or for creating a disruption inside an institution that prizes its surface calm above almost everything else. What emerged instead was something that no palace communications office had planned for and no opinion poll had anticipated or measured in advance. People felt it immediately and understood it without needing it explained, because most people have encountered at some point in their lives the very specific feeling of watching a parent decide that enough is enough and do something decisive and permanent about it. Social media filled quickly with people sharing their thoughts, and old footage of Princess Diana began circulating again. The clips of her stepping in front of her boys when cameras crowded too close, the moments where her arm moved across their shoulders in a way that was both instinctive and entirely deliberate, the images of her standing between her children and everything the world wanted from them before they were old enough to decide for themselves what they were willing to give. People who had never given much thought to the inner mechanics of royal family life were suddenly very engaged with the question of what it means to grow up inside an institution that has historically expected its youngest members to absorb things quietly and without complaint and call that resilience. The parallel between what Diana had experienced and what William was now refusing to allow for his own children was not a subtle one, and nobody who pointed it out was pretending otherwise. William gave no interviews about what had happened. No statement was released from the Wales household that addressed the specifics of the situation or offered any explanation of the reasoning behind it. The mandate stood exactly as it had been written from the first day it was issued. No revisions were made and no exceptions were quietly added after the fact. The terms remained in place and they held, and the complete absence of any visible back and forth or ongoing negotiation told the only story that needed to be told. The decision had been made. It was not going to be walked back under any circumstances. That was the full extent of the message. For those watching from outside the palace walls, the most striking element of the whole episode was ultimately the simplicity at its center. A child had been hurt. A parent had acted. The structure surrounding what followed was complex and layered and deeply shaped by the specific politics and history of one of the world's most closely watched institutions. But the core of it was something that required no knowledge of royal protocol or palace hierarchy to understand. A father had looked at the arrangements around his son, decided they had failed to protect him, and changed those arrangements himself in a way that left absolutely no room for anyone to claim the matter had been addressed on any terms other than his own. The palace moved forward. The family continued, but the balance of things had shifted in a way that was felt by everyone inside those walls, and the people who understood what that shift truly meant were watching the Wales household with a new and different kind of attention, not because of what had already happened, but because of everything that it quietly promised about what was still to come. So what do you think? Was William right to act the way he did, or did he go too far? And have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect someone you love? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.